The Bluegrass Hotel's ballroom stretched out before me like a battlefield draped in elegance, all crystal chandeliers and polished oak floors that gleamed under the soft glow of a dozen sconces. I stood near the entrance, my tie already feeling like a noose, the murmur of voices rising and falling like a tide I couldn't quite predict. Men in tailored suits and women in shimmering gowns moved with the grace of predators, their laughter sharp and calculated, every gesture a play for dominance. This was no ordinary reception party. It was a proving ground for Harper Distillery, my family's legacy, teetering on the edge of ruin or redemption. And I, Ethan Harper, was the reluctant heir thrust into the fray. The air carried the faint tang of bourbon, a scent that haunted my every waking moment, mingling with the cloying perfume of wealth. I adjusted my cufflinks, a nervous tic I'd picked up since taking over the distillery 6 months ago, after Dad's heart gave out his desk. Just another casualty of the empire he'd built, and I was scrambling to save. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavier than the oak barrels aging in our rickety warehouses. Tonight wasn't just about schmoozing Louisville's elite. It was about planting the seeds for a comeback, proving we weren't the fading dynasty the whispers claimed. I scanned the room, my eyes catching on familiar faces, competitors with smiles like switchblades, old money types who'd rather see us sink than share the spotlight. Then I saw her. She stood alone near the far wall, a figure carved from shadow and light, her elegant emerald dress catching the chandelier's gleam like a flame against the dark paneling. Lily. I didn't know her name yet, but something about her pulled at me. Maybe the way she held her glass, fingers tight around the stem, or the subtle tension in her shoulders, like she was bracing for an ambush. She wasn't mingling, wasn't playing the game. She looked out of place, and that made her the most interesting person here. I took a step toward her, then hesitated. Curiosity gnawed at me, sharp and insistent, but so did the unease. Who was she? Not one of the usual society vultures. That much was clear. Her dress screamed money, but her posture screamed something else, discomfort, maybe even defiance. I smoothed my jacket, squared my shoulders, and made my way across the room, dodging a waiter with a tray of champagne flutes and a cluster of bourbon barons debating barrel char levels like it was a blood sport. Up close, she was even more striking, dark hair swept into a loose chignon, eyes that flickered with something unreadable as they met mine. I offered a smile, the one I'd practiced in the mirror before these damn events, the one that said I belonged here even when I didn't feel it. Evening, I said, keeping my tone light, testing the waters. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else. She tilted her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. That obvious, huh? Her voice was low, edged with something dry. Sarcasm, maybe, or exhaustion. She glanced around the room, then back at me. I'm not exactly built for these circuses. I chuckled, leaning against the wall beside her, close enough to catch the faint scent of jasmine on her. You to me both. I'm Ethan, by the way. Ethan Harper. I extended a hand, half expecting her to brush it off. She didn't. Her grip was firm, cool fingers against my palm, and for a split second, I felt a jolt like static or something deeper. Lily Grayson, she said, pulling her hand back too quickly, her eyes darting away before settling on me again. Harper, as in Harper Distillery. Yeah, guilty as charged. I shrugged, trying to keep it casual, but her recognition threw me off. Most people here knew the name, sure, but the way she said it carried a weight I couldn't place. You a bourbon fan? Or just here for the free drinks? She hesitated, her smirk fading into something tighter, more guarded. Something like that. She sipped her drink, water, not bourbon, I noticed, and I caught the faintest tremble in her hand. Nervousness? Anger? I couldn't tell, but it stirred something in me, a hunger to know more. Before I could press, a voice cut through the hum of the crowd. Lucas Tate, my cousin and the distillery's self-appointed golden boy, swaggering over with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan, you hiding over here? Thought you'd be working the room by now. His gaze slid to Lily, lingering a beat too long. And who's this? Lily Grayson, I said, stepping slightly between them, an instinct I didn't fully understand. Lily, This is Lucas. My cousin. He thinks he runs the place. Lucas laughed, too loud, clapping me on the shoulder. Someone's got to keep the ship afloat while you play brooding air. He turned to Lily. Charm dialed up to 11. Grayson. That name sounds familiar. You from around here? Her jaw tightened just for a second before she answered. Not exactly. I grew up in Silver Ridge, though. Small town, a couple hours east. Silver Ridge. The name hit me like a punch to the gut, and I saw Lucas's eyes widen too. Our family's old stomping ground, the place where Harper Distillery was born, before it all went to hell, before the fire, the lawsuits, the whispers of sabotage that Dad never talked about. I opened my mouth to say something, but Lily was already watching me, her gaze sharp, like she'd caught the shift in the air. You know it? She asked, her voice steady now, but there was a challenge in it. Yeah, I said, swallowing hard. Yeah, I know it. The chandelier light fractured across the room, scattering shards of gold over the polished floors and the faces of Louisville's elite, but all I could focus on was the weight of that name. Silver Ridge, hanging in the air between us. It wasn't just a place. It was a ghost, a scar on the Harper family ledger that I'd never been allowed to touch. Dad had locked it away in silence, and here it was, spilling out of Lily Grayson's mouth like a secret I wasn't supposed to hear. My pulse kicked up, an unsteady rhythm against the hum of the reception party, and I caught Lucas's sidelong glance, his polished grin faltering for a split second before snapping back into place. Silver Ridge, Lucas echoed, his voice smooth as bourbon over ice, but I knew him well enough to hear the edge beneath it. He leaned closer to Lily, his broad shoulders cutting me out of the frame like he always did when he smelled an opportunity. That's a hell of a coincidence. Our granddad started the distillery there, back before it all went up in smoke. Literally. He chuckled, but it didn't land right, too forced, too hollow. Lily's eyes flicked between us, sharp and assessing, like she was piecing together a puzzle we didn't even know we'd laid out. I've heard the stories, she said, her tone measured, deliberate. The fire, the lawsuits, the way it tore the town apart. She paused, her fingers tightening around her glass again, and I saw it, the flicker of something raw in her face, gone as fast as it came. My family was there when it happened. The words hit me like a slug to the chest. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, just a dry rasp of air. My family was there when it happened. What the hell did that mean? I glanced at Lucas, expecting him to jump in with his usual charm offensive, but he was staring at her, his jaw tight, his grin replaced by something harder, colder. The room seemed to tilt, the chatter and clinking glasses fading into a dull roar as my mind raced. Silver Ridge wasn't just a shared history. It was a collision course, and I was standing smack in the middle of it. You're kidding. I finally managed, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. You're from that Grayson family? I didn't even know what I was asking. There'd been dozens of families caught in the fallout when the distillery burned, workers and townsfolk left with nothing but ash and broken promises. Dad had always said it was an accident, a freak spark in the warehouse, but the lawsuits told a different story. Negligence, corner cutting, whispers of something darker. I've been too young to understand it then, and too busy picking up the pieces now to dig into the past. Until this moment. Lily's gaze locked on mine, steady and unyielding, and I felt the air thicken, like the moment before a storm breaks. My father worked the stills, she said quietly, but there was steel in it. He was there the night it happened. Lost everything, his job, his health, damn near his life. We left Silver Ridge a year later, but never really left us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as barrel staves. The weight of her words settled into me, heavy and jagged, and I couldn't shake the image. Flames licking up the old wooden beams, smoke choking the night sky. A man I'd never met staggering out of the wreckage while my family rebuilt on the ashes. I wanted to say something, anything, but my tongue felt like lead. Lucas stepped in before I could find it. Well, damn, he said, his voice sliding back into that easy drawl, but his eyes were still sharp, calculating. That's one hell of a story, Lily. Makes you practically family, doesn't it? He clapped a hand on her shoulder, too familiar, too sudden, and I saw her flinch, just a twitch but enough to make my stomach twist. Then, to my shock, he pulled her into a quick, awkward hug, like he was claiming some kind of victory. Lucas, I started stepping forward, but he was already letting go, stepping back with that grin plastered on again, like nothing had happened. Just welcoming her to the fold. Ethan, he said, winking at me over her shoulder. Silver Ridge survivors, right? That's a bond worth toasting. He raised his glass, but Lily didn't move, her posture stiff, her eyes darting to me like she was waiting for something, for me to react, to explain, to fix this. I couldn't. My head was spinning, fragments of half-remembered conversations with Dad crashing into Lily's quiet fury, Lucas's opportunism, the weight of the Harper name pressing down harder than ever. I'd come to this party to save the distillery, to claw us back from the brink, but now it felt like I'd stumbled into a trap, one set decades ago, baited with fire and ruin. Lily wasn't just some stranger out of place. She was a reckoning, and I didn't know if I was ready to face it. Ethan, she said, her voice cutting through the haze, low and urgent. You okay? I blinked, realizing I'd been staring at her, my hands clenched at my sides. Yeah, I lied, forcing a nod. Just surprise is all. That was an understatement. My chest felt tight. My ambition, the drive to resurrect Harper Distillery, to prove myself, slamming up against something uglier, something I couldn't name yet. Guilt? Fear? The nagging sense that everything I'd built my life on was a house of cards waiting to collapse? Lucas laughed again, oblivious or pretending to be. Surprised? Hell, I'm thrilled. This is fate. Ethan, Silver Ridge coming back to us like this. Maybe Lily's the lucky charm. We need to turn things around. He slung an arm around my shoulders now, pulling me in like we were all in on some grand joke, but I shrugged him off, my skin prickling. Lily watched us both, her expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating off her, a mirror to my own. I'm no one's lucky charm, she said, her voice flat, final. She set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray, the movement deliberate, like she was drawing a line. I came here to see what's left of Harper Distillery, to see if it's worth anything, or if it's just more smoke and mirrors. Her words stung, sharp and personal, and I felt a flare of defensiveness rise in me, mingled with something else, curiosity, maybe, or the first spark of defiance. It's worth something, I said, meeting her gaze, holding it. I'm making sure of it. She didn't blink. Prove it. The challenge hung there, raw and electric, and I knew right then that this wasn't just about a party or a distillery anymore. It was about Silver Ridge, about what we'd done, what we owed, and what I was willing to risk to find out. Lucas was still grinning, oblivious to the shift, but I felt it in my bones. The story I'd been telling myself about who I was, what I was fighting for, had just cracked wide open. And Lily Grayson was the one holding the hammer. The Bluegrass Hotel's bar was a dim sanctuary compared to the ballroom's glittering chaos, its low amber lights casting long shadows across the mahogany counter. I leaned against it, the cool wood grounding me as I swirled the bourbon in my glass, the ice clinking softly, a sound that felt too fragile for the storm brewing inside me. Lily stood beside me, her posture rigid, her fingers tracing the rim of her own drink, untouched. The air between us crackled with something unspoken, a tension that had followed us from the reception like a shadow we couldn't shake. Prove it, she'd said, and those two words echoed in my skull, taunting me, daring me to step into a fight I wasn't sure I could win. The bar was half empty, a handful of stragglers from the party nursing their drinks in quiet corners. A lone bartender polished glasses at the far end, his movements slow and deliberate, oblivious to the weight of the moment unfolding a few feet away. I could still hear the faint hum of the ballroom through the double doors, laughter, clinking glasses, the dull roar of power plays. But here, it felt like we'd stepped into a different world, one where the mask could slip, if only for a moment. I glanced at Lily, her profile sharp against the warm light, and wondered what she saw when she looked at me. A savior? A fraud? Another Harper ready to burn everything down? You didn't have to follow me here, I said, breaking the silence, my voice rougher than I intended. I took a sip of the bourbon, Harper's own, the last of the old stock, and let it burn down my throat, a familiar punishment. She didn't look at me, her eyes fixed on the rows of bottles lining the back wall, their labels glinting like trophies. I didn't follow you, she replied, her tone cool, clipped. I needed a drink, and maybe some answers. I snorted, a bitter edge creeping into the sound. Answers? Good luck with that. I've been trying to figure this mess out for months, and I'm still wading through the muck. I set the glass down harder than I meant to, the thud reverberating in the quiet. You think I've got some grand plan to fix everything? I'm barely keeping the lights on. Her head turned then, her gaze locking onto mine, and I felt the air shift like a blade sliding into place. Then why am I here, Ethan? She asked, her voice low but piercing. Why drag me into this if you don't even know what you're fighting for? The question stung, sharp and personal, and I felt a flare of frustration rise in my chest, tangled with something deeper, guilt, maybe, or the gnawing fear that she was right. I'd brought her into this, hadn't I? Introduced her to Lucas, let her step into the ring with the Harper name hanging over us both, without even knowing what it meant. Silver Ridge loomed between us, a jagged piece of history I couldn't ignore anymore, and I hated how it made me feel, like a kid playing at being a king, out of my depth and drowning. I didn't drag you anywhere. I shot back, leaning closer, my voice dropping to match hers. You walked into that ballroom on your own. You threw Silver Ridge in my face. You're the one who said, prove it. So don't act like I'm the only one stirring the pot here. Her eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flashing in them, but she didn't flinch. Fair enough, she said, her tone steady, almost too calm. But you're the one wearing the Harper name like a crown. If you want me to believe it's worth something, you got to give me more than excuses. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped, the words dying on my tongue. She wasn't wrong. I'd spent months chasing the ghost of my father's legacy, pouring everything into the distillery, money, time, sleepless nights, because I thought it was mine to save. But standing here, with Lily's challenge ringing in my ears and the faint scent of bourbon clinging to the air, I felt the cracks widening. What was I fighting for? Pride? Duty? Or just the stubborn refusal to let it all slip away? I exhaled, running a hand through my hair, the tension coiling tighter in my gut. Look, I said, softer now, forcing myself to meet her gaze. I don't have all the answers. Not about Silver Ridge, not about what happened back then. But I'm trying to make this right, whatever right even means anymore. The bourbon tasting next week. It's a start, a chance to put Harper back on the map. If it works, maybe we can dig into the past, figure out what's owed. She tilted her head, studying me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something soften in her expression, just a flicker, gone as fast as it came. A bourbon tasting, she repeated, her voice dry, skeptical. That's your big move? Schmoozing a bunch of rich drunks to save a day. I smirked despite myself. It's not just schmoozing. It's a showcase. Our best barrels, the ones Dad stashed away before everything went to hell. If it lands, it's cash flow, credibility. A lifeline. I paused, the smirk fading, and maybe a way to start asking the questions I should have asked years ago. She didn't respond right away, her fingers drumming lightly on the bar, a restless rhythm that mirrored the thudding in my chest. I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, weighing me, measuring the distance between my words and the truth. I wanted her to believe me, needed her to more than I cared to admit, but I wasn't sure I believed myself. The tasting was a gamble, a roll of the dice with everything on the line, and the odds felt stacked against me. You really think it'll work? She asked finally, her voice quieter now, less guarded. Or are you just hoping it'll buy you time? I hesitated, the question cutting deeper than I expected. Both, I admitted, the honesty slipping out before I could stop it. I don't know if it'll work, Lily, but I'm out of moves. This is what I've got. She nodded, slow and deliberate, like she was filing that away for later. Then she picked up her glass, still untouched, and raised it slightly, a ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. To running out of moves, she said, her tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. Sarcasm, maybe, or a grudging respect. I raised my glass too, the ice clinking again, and we drank in silence. The bourbon hit me hard, a bitter warmth that matched the tangle of emotions churning inside me. Frustration, determination, and a creeping doubt I couldn't shake. I watched her over the rim of my glass, her face unreadable, and wondered what she was holding back. Silver Ridge wasn't just a memory for her. It was a wound, and I'd stumbled right into it, dragging my family's baggage along for the ride. The bartender shuffled closer, wiping down the counter, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror behind the bottles. Disheveled hair, shadows under my eyes, a man on the edge of something he couldn't control. I set the glass down, the sound too loud in the quiet, and turned to her. "Tell me something," I said, my voice low, urgent. "Why'd you really come tonight? You could have stayed away, left Harper Distillery in the past. Why show up now?" Her fingers stilled on the bar, and for a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then she looked at me, her eyes dark and steady, and I saw it, the glint of something raw, something dangerous. "Because I want to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know if you're different, if you're worth rooting for, or if you're just another Harper who'll leave ashes in his wake." The words landed like a punch, stealing the air from my lungs. I wanted to tell her I was different, that I'd prove it, that I'd claw my way out of the wreckage and build something worth believing in. But the truth was I didn't know. Not yet. And as I stood there, the bar's shadows pressing in around us, I felt the weight of that uncertainty settle into my bones, a challenge I couldn't back down from, even if it broke me. The distillery's tasting room smelled of oak and memory, a cavernous space where shadows clung to the rafters and the air hummed with the weight of what we'd wrought. I stood at the center of it, my boots scuffing against the worn plank floor, the faint echo of last night's bourbon tasting still ringing in my ears. The room was quiet now, save for the soft creak of the old building settling into itself. But just hours ago, it had been alive, packed with Louisville's bourbon elite, their voices a chorus of approval as they swirled glasses of our new Silver Ridge blend, the first real win Harper Distillery had scored in years. I could still feel the heat of their handshakes, the rare nods of respect from men who'd written us off as a dying name. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like a blade balanced on its edge, ready to tip either way. Lily was beside me, her presence a steady pulse in the stillness, her arms crossed as she studied the rows of barrels lining the walls. The afternoon light slanted through the high windows, catching the dust motes in a slow dance, painting her in shades of gold and gray. She hadn't said much since the crowd cleared out, but I could feel her watching me, waiting like she always did, searching for the crack in the facade I wasn't sure I could hide anymore. The success of the tasting had bought us breathing room, a lifeline of cash and credibility, but it had also cracked something open between us, something I couldn't name yet. Silver Ridge wasn't just a recipe anymore. It was a reckoning, and we were both standing in its shadow. I picked up a glass from the table, one of the last pours from the tasting, the amber liquid catching the light like a trapped flame. "This is it," I said, my voice low, almost reverent. "The perfected Silver Ridge. Took us 3 years to get here. Every tweak, every barrel, every fight with Lucas over the mash bill." I held it out to her, my hand steady despite the tremor I felt building inside me. "You should taste it. After everything you said last night, you deserve to know what we're fighting for." She hesitated, her eyes flicking from the glass to me, then back again. There was a wariness in her posture, a tension I'd come to recognize, the same tightness she'd carried at the Bluegrass Hotel, the same edge that sharpened every time Silver Ridge came up. She reached for the glass, her fingers brushing mine, and that brief contact sent a jolt through me, sharp and unbidden. She lifted it to her lips, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was stepping into a moment she couldn't take back. The room seemed to hold its breath as she tasted it, her eyes closing for a heartbeat before opening again, darker now, deeper. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, the glass still in her hand, her silence louder than any crowd. I watched her, my chest tight, waiting for something, approval, rejection, anything to tell me where we stood. Finally, she lowered the glass, her gaze locking onto mine, and I saw it, a flicker of surprise, maybe even wonder, chased by something harder, something that cut. "It's good," she said, her voice quiet but firm, like she was testing the words as much as the bourbon. "Better than good. It's real." Like the old silver ridge my dad used to talk about before. She stopped, her jaw tightening, and I knew what she didn't say. Before the fire, before the ruin, before my family left hers in the dust. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. That's what I wanted. Something honest. Something that doesn't hide from what we were. I took a step closer, the space between us shrinking, the air growing thick with the scent of bourbon and the weight of what hung unsaid. "Last night, you asked if I was different. This is my answer, Lily. This is me trying to make it right." Her eyes searched mine, sharp and unrelenting, and I felt exposed, like she could see straight through to the tangle of ambition and guilt knotting up my insides. "Trying's not enough," she said, her tone steady but laced with a challenge. "You got the taste down, Ethan. You've got the room buzzing, the money coming in. But what happens next? You can't just pour a good bourbon and call it justice." The word justice hit me like a slap, raw and unyielding, and I felt a surge of something hot and restless rise in me. Justice. Was that what this was about? Not just survival, not just pride, but something bigger, something I'd been dodging since she walked into that ballroom and threw Silver Ridge back in my face? I turned away, pacing a few steps toward the barrels, my hands clenching in a fist at my sides. The distillery loomed around me, its walls heavy with history. My history, her history, a legacy I'd inherited without ever asking for it. "You think I don't know that?" I said, spinning back to face her, my voice rougher now, fraying at the edges. "You think I don't feel it every damn day? The weight of what happened, what my family did or didn't do. I wasn't there, Lily. I didn't light the match. But I'm here now, and I'm trying to build something out of the ashes. What else am I supposed to do?" She didn't flinch, didn't back down, just stood there with that quiet strength that made me want to shake her and pull her closer all at once. "Dig deeper," she said, her words cutting through the haze. "You've got the bourbon, Ethan, but you don't have the truth. Not yet. What really happened that night? Why did my dad come home coughing up black smoke while your family walked away with a new distillery in Louisville? You want to make it right? Start there." Her voice trembled on the last words, just enough to crack the armor she wore, and I saw it. The pain she'd carried all these years, the wound Silver Ridge had left in her. It mirrored something in me, a fear I'd buried under layers of defiance and bourbon barrels, that the truth might be uglier than I could handle, that my father's silence wasn't protection but cowardice. I wanted to argue, to tell her it didn't matter, that the past was dead and buried, but it wasn't. It was standing right here in her eyes, in the glass she still held, in the success of the tasting that suddenly felt hollow. I took a breath, the air sharp with the sting of oak and regret, and stepped closer again, close enough to feel the heat of her, the pull of her presence. "Okay," I said, my voice low, resolute. "You're right. The tasting's a start, but it's not enough. I'll dig. I'll find out what happened, really happened. But I can't do it alone. You know Silver Ridge, Lily. You lived it. Help me." Her eyes widened, just a fraction, surprise flashing across her face before she masked it again. She set the glass down on the table, the soft clink ringing in the quiet. And for a moment, I thought she'd turn away, walk out, leave me standing here with my half-formed promises. But she didn't. She crossed her arms again, her posture shifting, like she was bracing herself for a fight she'd already decided to join. "Why should I?" she asked, her tone sharp but curious, testing me one last time. "What's in it for me, Ethan? Closure? Revenge? Or just another Harper promising more than he can deliver?" I didn't hesitate, didn't let myself think too long, because the answer was there, clawing its way up from somewhere deep and desperate. "Hope," I said, meeting her gaze, holding it. "Hope that we can turn this into something better, that we don't have to be what they left us with. I don't know if I can deliver. Lily, I won't lie to you. I'll damn well try. And I think you want to see it through as much as I do." The silence stretched, heavy and electric, and I felt my pulse thudding in my ears, every nerve on edge as I waited for her to decide. Her lips parted, just slightly, and I saw the conflict flicker in her eyes, doubt warring with something brighter, something that looked like the first spark of belief. She exhaled a slow, measured breath, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less fierce. "All right," she said, nodding once decisive. "I'm in. But don't expect me to go easy on you, Ethan. We're digging for the truth, your truth, my truth, and it's gonna hurt. You ready for that?" I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling into me like a stone, but I didn't look away. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady now, a fire kindling in my chest. "I'm ready." She held my gaze a moment longer, then turned to the barrels, her silhouette stark against the fading light, and I knew this was it. The turning point, the moment everything shifted. The tasting had saved the distillery, but this promise, this pact, might save us. Or break us. And as the shadows lengthened around us, I felt the first real stirrings of fear, tangled with a hope I hadn't dared to name until now. The distillery's tasting room felt smaller now, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. The barrels loomed around us, their dark curves catching the last slivers of afternoon light, casting jagged shadows that danced across the plank floor. I stood there, my boots rooted to the spot, Lily's words still ringing in my ears. Asterisk, we're digging for the truth, and it's going to hurt. Asterisk, her silhouette was sharp against the glow, her arms crossed, her posture unyielding, and yet there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a glint of resolve, maybe, or the faintest trace of trust. It made my chest ache in a way I didn't expect, a pull I couldn't shake loose. I turned away, pacing toward the far wall where a rickety table held a stack of old ledgers, Dad's records, the ones I'd been too stubborn or too scared to crack open until now. The leather covers were cracked, the pages yellowed, and the sight of them twisted something deep in my gut. This was where the answers hid, buried in ink and dust, and I'd avoided them like a coward. But not anymore. Not with Lily standing there. Her presence a quiet demand I couldn't ignore. I picked up the top ledger, the weight of it heavy in my hands, and flipped it open, the faint creak of the spine slicing through the silence. "What are you doing?" Lily's voice cut through the stillness, sharp but curious, her footsteps soft as she moved closer. I could feel her behind me, close enough that the scent of jasmine brushed against the oak and bourbon in the air. "Starting where you told me to," I said, my voice low, rougher than I meant it to be. "If we're digging, this is ground zero. My dad's notes, his accounts, everything from before the fire. If there's truth to find, it's here." I ran a finger down a column of numbers. The ink faded, but legible, dates and figures from decades past staring back at me like ghosts. She stepped beside me, her shoulder brushing mine, and I caught the flicker of surprise in her face as she leaned in to look. "You've had these all this time?" she asked, her tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. Accusation, maybe, or disbelief. "And you never thought to open them?" I swallowed hard, the guilt rising like bile in my throat. "I thought about it plenty," I admitted, keeping my eyes on the page, afraid to meet hers. "But thinking and doing are two different things. After Dad died, I was too busy keeping the roof from caving in, creditors, leaky stills, Lucas breathing down my neck. These just sat here, waiting." Her silence was louder than any reply, a judgment I felt in my bones. I flipped another page, the rustle loud in the quiet, and there it was, a line entry from July 1998, the year Silver Ridge burned. "Payment to Grayson T. $500 severance." My breath caught, a cold jolt running through me. Grayson, her father. I stared at the words, the numbers, the stark simplicity of it. A man's life reduced to a single line, a pittance tossed his way while my family rebuilt on the ashes. "Lily," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, turning the ledger so she could see. "Look at this." She leaned in, her breath hitching as her eyes landed on the entry. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, her fingers hovering over the page like she was afraid to touch it. Then her jaw tightened, and I saw the storm brewing in her eyes. Anger, yes, but something softer too. something that looked like grief. $500, she said finally, her voice trembling with a fury she barely held in check. That's what they gave him. After 20 years at the stills, after the smoke ate his lungs, that's what your family thought he was worth. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words stuck heavy and useless. What could I say? That it wasn't my call? That I wasn't there? It didn't matter. The ledger stared back at us, cold and unyielding, a piece of the puzzle snapping into place with a brutality I hadn't braced for. I'd known there was pain in Silver Ridge's shadow, but seeing it like this, quantified, dismissed, hit me like a fist to the gut. I didn't know. I said finally, the admission slipping out, raw and unsteady. I swear, Lily, I didn't know it was like this. She turned to me then, her eyes blazing, and I felt the full weight of her stare, like a judge, a jury, a mirror I couldn't escape. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, she shot back, her voice cutting through me. You've been sitting on this for months, years, maybe, and you didn't look. Why, Ethan? Because it was easier to play the hero, to pour your fancy bourbon and call it a fresh start. Her words stung, sharp and true, and I felt a flare of defensiveness rise in me, hot and reckless. You think I wanted this? I snapped, stepping closer, the ledger still clutched in my hand. You think I asked to inherit a sinking ship with a ghost story attached? I've been fighting tooth and nail to keep this place alive, to prove I'm not my father. And now you're telling me it's not enough, that I'm still the villain here. She didn't flinch, didn't back down, just held my gaze with that quiet fire that made my chest tighten. I'm not saying you're the villain, she said, her voice steady now, though it shook at the edges. I'm saying you're part of it, whether you like it or not. And pretending otherwise doesn't change the truth. The air between us crackled, thick with the weight of her words, and I felt the ground shift beneath me, like the distillery itself was tilting, ready to swallow me whole. I wanted to argue, to push back, but the ledger in my hand felt like a brand, searing her point into my skin. She was right. I'd been running from this, chasing a redemption I hadn't earned, and now it was staring me in the face, ugly, messy, and mine to fix. I set the ledger down, the thud echoing in the stillness, and ran a hand through my hair, my pulse thudding in my ears. Okay, I said, quieter now, forcing myself to meet her eyes. You're right. I've been dodging this, maybe my whole life. But I'm looking now, and I need you to tell me what you know, Lily. Your dad, Silver Ridge, what really happened? Because I can't do this without you. Her expression softened, just a fraction, surprise flickering across her face before she masked it again. She took a step back, leaning against the table, her arms still crossed like a shield. For a moment, she didn't speak, her gaze drifting to the barrels, the shadows, the weight of the past pressing down on us both. Then she exhaled, a slow, ragged breath, and when she looked at me again, there was something new in her eyes, vulnerability, raw and unguarded. My dad never talked much about it, she said, her voice low, deliberate, like she was pulling the words from a deep well. He'd get this look, though distant, hollow, like he was seeing the fire all over again. He said it started in the warehouse, late shift. Said the alarms didn't go off until it was too late, and by then, the smoke was so thick he couldn't see his own hands. He got out, barely, but half the crew didn't. And your family, they called it an accident, paid out what they could, moved on. But Dad always said it wasn't that simple. Said there were corners cut, safety checks skipped, things he'd warned them about for years. I listened, my chest tightening with every word, the distillery's walls seeming to close in around me. Corners cut, safety checks skipped. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread, a jagged edge of the truth I'd been too afraid to pull. Did he ever say who? I asked, my voice hoarse. Who ignored him? Who let it happen? She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't name names. Not to me. But he'd mutter sometimes about the Harpers, about how they cared more about profit than people. I was a kid, Ethan, I didn't understand it then. I just knew he was broken, and we lost everything because of it. The weight of it settled into me, heavy and suffocating, and I felt a rush of something I couldn't name. Anger, shame, a desperate need to make it right. I stepped closer, my hands clenching at my sides, and before I could stop myself, the words spilled out, raw and unfiltered. Lily, I care about this. About you. More than the distillery. More than any of it. I've been fighting for this place, but standing here, with you, it's you I want to fight for. Her eyes widened, shock flashing across her face, and I realized too late what I'd said. How it sounded, how it hung there between us, naked and reckless. My heart slammed against my ribs, a mix of fear and hope churning in my gut, and I waited, breathless, for her to respond. She straightened, her arms dropping to her sides, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head, a small, sharp movement, and took a step back. No, Ethan, she said, her voice firm but tinged with something softer. Regret, maybe, or sadness. Don't do that. This isn't about that. It can't be. We're here for the truth, not for whatever this is. The rejection hit me like a cold wave, sharp and sudden, and I felt the air rush out of me, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I wanted to argue, to tell her I meant it, that it wasn't just the heat of the moment, but she was right. This wasn't the time, and maybe it never would be. I nodded, swallowing hard, forcing the sting of it down. Okay, I said, my voice rough but steady. You're right. The truth first. She nodded too, her posture softening, and I saw a flicker of relief in her eyes, like she'd dodged something she wasn't ready to face. Good, she said, her tone brisk now, businesslike. Let's keep looking. There's more in those ledgers. I can feel it. Something that'll tell us what really went down. I turned back to the table, my hands trembling slightly as I picked up another ledger, the disappointment still burning in my chest. But beneath it, there was something else, a spark, faint but stubborn, a hope that maybe, just maybe, we could still find a way through this. Together. The truth was out there, buried in these pages, in her memory, in the ashes of Silver Ridge, and I'd dig until my hands bled if it meant proving I was more than the name I carried. The distillery's office was a tomb of shadows and secrets, its narrow walls pressing in like a vice as I sat at the old oak desk, the ledger still open in front of me. The single bulb overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the pages, the ink smudged and faded but sharp enough to cut. My hands rested on either side of it, fingers splayed, as if I could hold the truth in place, keep it from slipping through the cracks of my resolve. Lily stood across from me, leaning against the filing cabinet, her arms crossed tight, her breath shallow and uneven. The air between us was heavy, clogged with the dust of decades and the weight of what we'd just unearthed. Outside, the wind howled through the Kentucky hills, rattling the window panes like a warning I couldn't ignore. I'd flipped through 3 more ledgers since we left the tasting room, each one a deeper dive into the abyss of Silver Ridge's collapse. The numbers didn't lie. Payments slashed, maintenance logs skipped, a pattern of neglect stretching back years before the fire. And then, buried in a scribbled note from '97, a name, Robert Tate. Lucas's father, my uncle, the man who'd run the day-to-day, while Dad played the face of Harper Distillery. A single line, RT insists on cutting vent checks, says budget's tight. And suddenly, the pieces snapped together with a sickening clarity. Corners cut. Safety ignored. A spark waiting to happen. I stared at the words, my pulse pounding in my temples, a dull roar building in my ears. Robert Tate, the uncle who died in a car wreck a year after the fire, leaving Lucas to inherit his charm and his secrets. I'd always thought of him as a shadow figure, a gruff voice in old family stories, but now he was a ghost with blood on his hands, and I was holding the proof. My chest tightened, a knot of anger and betrayal twisting inside me, and I slammed the ledger shut, the sound cracking through the silence like a gunshot. Ethan, Lily's voice was sharp, pulling me back from the edge. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as they searched my face. What is it? What did you find? I didn't answer right away, couldn't. My throat felt like it was lined with sand, every breath a struggle. I shoved the ledger across the desk toward her, the pages fluttering open to that damning note. Read it. I said, my voice low, ragged. Robert Tate. Lucas's dad. He's the one who let it happen. She leaned over the desk, her fingers brushing the paper as she scanned the line, and I watched her face shift. Shock first, then a slow, burning fury that mirrored my own. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were dark, fierce, a storm ready to break. Your uncle, she said, the words clipped deliberate. He knew. He chose this. And your family covered it up. I stood up fast, the chair scraping against the floor, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. I didn't know, Lily. I snapped, the defensiveness flaring hot and sharp. You think I'd sit on this if I'd known? I was a kid when it happened, 10 years old, playing in the backyard while they buried it all. I didn't ask for this. She straightened, unflinching, her gaze locking onto mine like a blade. Maybe you didn't, she said, her voice steady but laced with venom. But you're here now, Ethan. You're the one holding the reins. And Lucas, he's been strutting around like he owns the place, like none of it ever happened. Did he know? Has he been laughing behind your back this whole time? The question hit me like a punch, stealing the air from my lungs. Lucas, my cousin, my rival, the golden boy who'd push me every step of the way. Charming the Bourbon elite, nudging me toward the Silver Ridge revival like it was his grand idea. Had he known? Had he been playing me, feeding me just enough rope to hang myself while he kept the family's dirty laundry tucked away? I thought of his easy grin, the way he'd hug Lily at the reception, claiming her story like a trophy. My stomach churned, while rising in my throat, and I turned away, pacing the cramped room, the walls closing in tighter with every step. I don't know, I said finally, my voice breaking, hoarse with the strain of it. I don't know what he knows, but I want to find out. I stopped, facing the window, the glass streaked with grime and rain that had started to fall, a slow, relentless drum against the panes. He's coming by tomorrow, says he wants to talk numbers after the tasting. I'll get out of him, one way or another. Lily moved closer, her boots soft against the floor, and I felt her presence like a heat in my back. And what if he didn't know? She asked, her tone quieter now, but no less piercing. What then, Ethan? You going to confront him? Tear it all down? Or are you going to let it slide? Keep pouring your bourbon and pretending it's enough? I spun around, my eyes blazing, the anger spilling over before I could stop it. You think I'd let it slide? I shot back, stepping toward her, close enough to feel the tension radiating off her. After everything we've done, years of grinding, perfecting Silver Ridge, clawing this place back from the edge, you think I'd just shrug and walk away? This isn't just about bourbon anymore, Lily. It's about what they took from your dad, from you, from everyone who burned that night. I'm not letting it go. Her eyes widened, just a fraction, surprise flickering beneath the steel, and for a moment we stood there, inches apart, the air crackling with the weight of it all. I could see the pulse jumping in her throat, the way her hands tightened into fists at her sides, mirroring mine. She didn't back down, didn't soften, but something shifted in her gaze, a spark of belief, maybe, or the grudging recognition that I was in this as deep as she was. Good, she said finally, her voice firm, resolute. Because I'm not either. But this is bigger than us now. If Lucas knew, if he's been hiding it, we're not just fighting the past. We're fighting him. And he's not going to go down easy. I nodded, the reality of it sinking into me like a stone, cold, heavy, unyielding. Lucas wasn't just family. He was a power player, a man who'd spent years building his own empire within mine, charming the board, wooing the investors. If he'd known about Robert, if he'd kept it quiet, he wouldn't just roll over. He'd fight, dirty, if he had to, and I'd be the one standing in the crosshairs. The distillery, the revival, everything we'd built over the past 3 years hung in the balance, and the thought of losing it, of losing her, tore at me like a blade. I sank back into the chair, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion I couldn't shake. My hands scrubbed over my face, the stubble rough against my palms, and I let out a ragged breath. 3 years, I said, more to myself than to her, the words spilling out unbidden. 3 years of late nights, burned batches, arguing with you over every damn tweak to that recipe. We got it perfect, Lily. Silver Ridge, it's ours. And now it's all about to blow up in our faces. She didn't respond right away, just stood there, watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes. Then she pulled out the chair across from me and sat, the scrape of wood against wood jarring in the quiet. It's not blowing up yet, she said, her tone brisk, practical, cutting through the haze. We've got the proof, or the start of it. We've got the bourbon, the momentum. Lucas doesn't know we're onto this. That's our edge. We use it. I looked at her, her face framed by the dim light, and felt a flicker of something steadier. Hope? Maybe, or the stubborn refusal to break. She was right. We weren't done. Not yet. I reached for the ledger again, flipping it back open, my finger tracing that damning note. Tomorrow, I said, my voice hardening with resolve. He walks in here, thinking it's business as usual. I'll push him hard. See what he gives up. You with me? She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I've been with you for 3 years, Ethan, she said, her voice low, fierce. Through every batch, every fight, every time you wanted to quit, and I wouldn't let you. I'm not walking away now, but you need to be ready. He's family. This isn't just business. It's blood. The word, blood, hung there, sharp and final, and I felt it settle into me, a truth I couldn't dodge. Lucas was blood, yeah, but so was the distillery, so was Silver Ridge, so was the debt we owed to her father, and every soul caught in that fire. I'd spent years building something I thought was mine, but now it was a battlefield and the lines were drawn. My ambition, my pride, my need to prove myself. It was all crashing into the reality of what I'd inherited, and I couldn't run from it anymore. I nodded, slow and deliberate, my hand steady now as I closed the ledger. I'm ready, I said, meeting her gaze, holding it. Whatever it takes. She didn't smile, didn't soften, just gave me a single, sharp nod, a soldier's agreement, a partner's vow. The rain beat harder against the window, the wind howling louder, and I felt the storm inside me match it. Rage, fear, a desperate determination to see this through. Tomorrow, Lucas would walk through that door, and I'd face him not as a cousin, but as a man with everything to lose. The distillery creaked around us, its walls heavy with secrets, and I knew this was just the beginning. The crisis was here, and the pressure was crushing, but I wouldn't break. Not with her beside me. The distillery's office felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of rain seeping through the cracked window frame. I stood behind the desk, my hands braced against its scarred surface, the ledger still open to that damning note about Robert Tate. The faint hum of the overhead bulb flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room, and outside, the storm raged on, a relentless drumbeat against the glass that matched the pounding in my chest. Lily sat across from me, her elbows on the desk, her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made the space between us feel alive, electric. We just laid out our plan, confront Lucas, push him until he cracked, but the weight of it hung over us like a guillotine, blade poised to drop. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its hands creeping toward the moment Lucas would walk through that door tomorrow morning, smug and oblivious, expecting to talk profits while I'd be aiming for his throat. I could still see his grin from the reception party, hear his laugh echoing through the tasting room, and now it all felt like a mask, a lie I'd been too blind to see through. My fingers tightened against the wood, the grain biting into my palms, and I felt the storm inside me swell. Anger at him, and my father at myself for not digging sooner. But beneath it, there was something else, something sharper. Fear. Fear that this would break everything. The distillery, my family, the fragile thing I'd built with Lily over 3 years of sweat and bourbon. She shifted in her chair, the scrape of it loud in the quiet, and I caught the glint of resolve in her eyes, steady as steel. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice low, probing, like she was testing the ground beneath us. "Once you start pushing Lucas, there's no going back. He's not just your cousin. He's got pull, Ethan. The board, The investors, they love him. You take him down, you might take it all down with him. I straightened, my jaw tightening as I met her gaze. I'm sure, I said, the words coming out harder than I meant them to, a vow I couldn't unmake. He doesn't get to walk away from this. Not if he knew. Not if he's been playing me this whole time. The distillery's mine, Lily. I fought for it, bled for it. If it goes down, it's not because I let him hide behind a smile. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close, a flicker of approval, maybe a recognition of the fire I felt burning through me. She leaned back, crossing her arms, the chair creaking under her weight. All right, she said, her tone brisk, decisive. But you've got to be smart about it. He's slick, always has been. You push too hard, he'll dodge. You don't push enough, he'll bury you. I nodded, my mind already racing, mapping out the confrontation like a chessboard. Every move, every countermove. I knew Lucas better than anyone. His charm, his temper, the way he'd twist a room to his favor with a laugh and a well-timed jab. But I had something he didn't, the truth, or at least the jagged edge of it, clutched in that ledger like a loaded gun. I'd use it, wield it, until he gave me what I needed, or until he broke. The rain lashed harder against the window, a gust rattling the frame, and I crossed to it, peering out into the dark. The distillery's silhouette loomed against the storm, its brick walls streaked with water, the warehouses hulking shadows in the distance. This place was more than a business. It was my blood, my bones, a legacy I clawed back from ruin. And now, it was a battleground, the stakes higher than I'd ever imagined. I turned back to Lily, her face half lit by the bulb, and felt a surge of something raw. Gratitude, maybe, or the desperate need to not face this alone. You don't have to stay, I said, my voice softer now, rough with the strain of the night. Tomorrow's going to be ugly. You've already given me more than I deserve. 3 years, Silver Ridge, all of it. You could walk away now. Let me handle Lucas. She tilted her head, studying me, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Hurt, maybe, or disbelief. Then she stood, slow and deliberate, her boots thudding against the floor as she closed the distance between us. She stopped a foot away, close enough that I could feel the heat of her, the faint scent of jasmine cutting through the musty air. Walk away, she said, her voice low, edged with a quiet fury. After everything, you think I'd leave you to face this alone? Ethan, I'm not here because I have to be. I'm here because I want to be. Because Silver Ridge isn't just your fight. It's mine too. Her words hit me like a jolt, stealing the breath from my lungs, and I felt the weight of them settle into me. Her loyalty, her fire, the unspoken bond we'd forged over years of late nights and shared dreams. I'd pushed her away once, confessed too much in the tasting room, and she'd drawn a line. But here she was crossing it, standing with me when the walls were closing in. My throat tightened, a mix of relief and something deeper churning in my chest, and I nodded, unable to find the words. Good. I managed finally, my voice hoarse. Because I don't know if I can do this without you. She didn't reply, just held my gaze a moment longer, her eyes searching mine like she was measuring the man I'd become against the one she'd met 3 years ago. Then she turned, pacing back to the desk, her fingers brushing the ledger as she spoke. We need more, she said, her tone shifting to something practical, focused. This note, it's a start, but it's not enough. Lucas will deny it, say it's out of context, pin it on Robert, and wash his hands. We need proof he knew, something concrete. I followed her, leaning over the desk beside her, the closeness of her steadying me even as my mind spun. There's more in here, I said, flipping the ledger back open, my finger tracing the faded lines. Invoices, letters. Dad kept everything. If Lucas wasn't on it, there'll be a trail. He's not as careful as he thinks. We dug in, the hours blurring as we combed through the pages. Yellowed receipts, scrawled memos, a ledger entry here, a cryptic note there. The storm outside faded to a dull roar. The clock ticking past 2, then 3, but we didn't stop. My eyes burned, my back ached, but every scrap we found fueled me. A maintenance report ignored, a payout to a lawyer I didn't recognize, a letter from Robert to Dad dated a month before the fire, vague but chilling. We're stretched thin, but the risk's on them, not us them. The workers. Lily's father. My stomach twisted, the guilt and rage a living thing clawing at my insides. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, a gray dawn bleeding through the storm, we had a stack of papers, enough to raise questions, enough to corner Lucas, but not enough to bury him. Not yet. I leaned back, scrubbing my hands over my face, the exhaustion crashing over me like a wave. Lily sat across from me, her hair loose now, strands falling in her eyes as she studied a final page, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This one," she said suddenly, sliding it toward me, her voice sharp with discovery. "Look, Lucas's signature. A requisition form, 2 weeks after the fire. He ordered new barrels, signed off on the budget himself. He was in the room, Ethan. He had to know what Robert was doing." I snatched the paper, my pulse spiking as I scanned it. His looping scrawl, unmistakable, dated August 98. My cousin, barely 20 then, stepping into the mess Robert left behind, signing off on the rebuild while Silver Ridge smoldered. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a thread I could pull until it unraveled him. I looked up at Lily, her face flushed with the same fire I felt, and a grim smile tugged at my lips. "He's done," I said, my voice low, resolute. "He walks in here in a few hours, and I'm going to make him choke on this." She nodded, her eyes blazing with a mix of triumph and something darker. Justice, maybe, or the ghost of revenge. "We're ready," she said, leaning forward, her hands flat on the desk. "But you've got to keep it together, Ethan. He'll push back hard. He'll try to turn it on you, on me, on anything he can grab. Don't let him." "I won't," I promised, the words a vow to her, to myself, to the truth we'd clawed out of the dark. I stood, the chair scraping back, and crossed to the window again, the dawn light cold and unforgiving against the glass. The distillery stretched out below, its brick and iron a testament to everything I'd fought for and everything I was about to risk. Lucas would come, and I'd face him, not as family, but as a man with a debt to settle, a legacy to reclaim. The door rattled faintly in its frame, the wind still howling, and I turned back to Lily, her silhouette stark against the dim room. "Get some rest," I said, my voice softening. "We got a fight coming." She shook her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Not a chance," she said, standing too, her posture unyielding. "I'm in this with you, all the way." And as the first rays of light broke through the storm, I felt it, the clash looming, the high tide of everything we'd built crashing toward its peak. Lucas didn't know it yet, but he'd ignited something he couldn't control. The reckoning was here, and I was ready to burn it all down if it meant rising from the ashes with her. The distillery's unveiling room was a cathedral of light and shadow, its high ceilings ribbed with old beams that gleamed under the soft glow of strung lanterns. I stood at the heart of it, my boots planted on the worn oak floor, the air thick with the scent of charred barrels and the faint, sweet bite of bourbon lingering from last night's storm. The space hummed with a quiet energy, the kind that comes after a battle's won, but before the dust settles. A hush broken only by the distant clink of glasses being set out on the long tasting table. Tonight was the night. The revived Silver Ridge would meet the world, not just in whispers or ledgers, but in full, amber glory. My chest felt tight, a knot of pride and dread twisting together, and I couldn't tell if it was the weight of the moment or the ghost still clinging to the rafters. Lily stood a few feet away, her silhouette sharp against the warm light spilling through the tall windows, her dark hair catching the glow like a thread of ink. She was adjusting a bottle on the table. Our asterisk bottle, the one we'd spent 3 years perfecting, its label crisp with the Silver Ridge name in bold, unapologetic letters. Her movements were steady, deliberate, but I caught the faint tremble in her fingers as she straightened it just so. She felt it too, this precipice we'd climbed to, this edge we could still fall from. The room was empty now, the guests not due for another hour, but it felt alive, heavy with everything we'd poured into it. Sweat, secrets, the jagged truth we'd clawed out of the dark. I crossed the floor, my steps echoing in the stillness, and stopped beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence cutting through the chill. "Looks good," I said, my voice low, rougher than I meant it to be. I nodded at the bottle, but my eyes were on her, searching her face for the cracks I knew mirrored my own. "Better than good. It's us." She glanced at me, her lips twitching into a half smile, fleeting but real. "Don't get sentimental on me now, Ethan," she said, her tone dry, teasing, but there was a softness beneath it, a thread of something we'd earned through years of fighting side by side. "We're not done yet. They've still got to taste it, buy it, believe in it." I chuckled, the sound easing some of the tension coiled in my gut. "They will," I said, leaning against the table, my hands braced on its edge. "They'll taste it and know what we knew 3 years ago, that it's more than bourbon. It's a damn promise." I paused, the words catching in my throat, heavier than I'd intended. "A promise I'm keeping, to you, to your dad, to everyone we dug this up for." Her eyes met mine, steady and dark, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to just us and the weight of what we'd done. Lucas was gone. Yesterday's confrontation had been a brutal, bloody unraveling, his charm cracking under the pressure of those ledgers. His signature on that requisition formed the noose I'd tightened until he snapped. He'd confessed, voice shaking, to knowing Robert's cuts, to burying it for the sake of the family name. The board had turned on him, the investors had balked, and by noon, he'd walked out, tail between his legs, leaving me the last Harper standing. It should have felt like victory, but it didn't, not entirely. It felt like a hollowed-out shell, a win carved from loss. Lily tilted her head, studying me, and I knew she saw it, the shadow behind my eyes, the cost of tearing into my own blood. "You did what you had to," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the haze. "Lucas made his choices. You made yours. And this," she tapped the bottle with a finger, the glass ringing faintly. "This is what's left. It's not hollow, Ethan. It's real." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat burning as I reached for the bottle, my fingers brushing hers as I lifted it. The glass was cool against my palm, solid, a tether to the ground I'd fought to hold. "Let's taste it," I said, my voice steady now, a resolve settling into my bones. "One last time, just us before the circus rolls in." She nodded, a spark of something bright flickering in her eyes, and grabbed 2 glasses from the table, setting them between us with a soft clink. I uncorked the bottle, the pop echoing in the quiet, and poured, slow, deliberate, watching the amber liquid catch the light as it swirled into the glasses. The scent hit me first, rich and layered, caramel, oak, a hint of smoke that carried me back to Silver Ridge, to the fire I hadn't seen but felt in every line of those ledgers, every word Lily had shared about her father. I handed her a glass, our fingers brushing again, and this time, neither of us pulled away fast. We raised them together, a silent toast, and I took a sip, letting the bourbon roll over my tongue, smooth, bold, a kick of heat that softened into something deeper, something honest. It was perfect, better than I'd dared hope, and as I swallowed, I felt a rush of triumph, sharp and sweet, cutting through the ache. Lily lowered her glass, her eyes closing for a heartbeat as she savored it, and when they opened again, they were brighter, wetter, like the taste had unlocked something she'd kept buried. "It's him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with a mix of awe and grief. "My dad. He'd sit on the porch with a glass of the old Silver Ridge, telling me stories about the stills. This is what he loved, what he lost." The words hit me hard, a fist to the chest, and I set my glass down, my hand shaking slightly as I leaned closer. "Then we did it," I said, my voice rough with emotion I couldn't hide. "We brought it back for him, for you. I couldn't save what happened, Lily, but I could damn well make sure it wasn't forgotten." She looked at me, really looked, and I saw the shift, anger giving way to something softer, something that felt like release. "You did more than that," she said, her tone steady now, stronger. "You faced it, Lucas, your dad, the whole messy truth. I didn't think you would. Not at first. But you did. And I'm proud of you, Ethan. Pride. The word sank into me, warm and unfamiliar, and I felt my throat tighten, my eyes stinging with the threat of tears I wouldn't let fall. I'd spent years chasing approval. My father's, the Bourbon world's my own. But hers? Hers was the one I hadn't known I needed until it was there, raw and real, staring me in the face. I wanted to say something, to tell her what it meant, but my voice failed me, and instead, I just nodded, a jerky, uneven motion that said more than words could. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, and I glanced around the room. The barrels lining the walls, the lanterns flickering overhead, the table set for a crowd that would soon flood in with their money and their praise. It was ours, this moment, this victory, but it wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a slate wiped clean, but not empty, a chance to build something new from the ashes we'd sifted through. What now? I asked finally, my voice quieter, the question hanging between us like a thread waiting to be pulled. The distillery's back. Silver Ridge is alive. Lucas is out. Where do we go from here? Lily set her glass down, crossing her arms as she leaned against the table, her gaze drifting to the windows where the evening sky was deepening to dusk. We keep going, she said, simple but certain, like it was the only answer that mattered. We make more, better bourbon, better choices. We don't let it rot again. And maybe, she paused, her eyes flicking back to me, a ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. Maybe we figure out what's next together. Together. The word landed soft but sure, and I felt it settle into me. A promise, a hope, a future I hadn't dared imagine until now. I lost her once, in that tasting room confession she'd shut down, and I'd carried the sting of it like a bruise. But this wasn't that. This was different, stronger, steadier, built on trust instead of desperation. I nodded, a slow grin breaking across my face, the first real one I'd felt in days. Together, I echoed, stepping closer, the space between us shrinking but not closing. Not yet. I like the sound of that. She smirked, a flash of the old fire sparking in her eyes, and pushed off the table, turning to face the room as the first sounds of footsteps echoed from the hall. The guests arriving, the world crashing back in. Good, she said over her shoulder, her voice light but laced with challenge. Because you're still a pain in the ass to work with, Harper. Don't think this changes that. I laughed, the sound bursting out of me, free and unguarded, and followed her as the doors swung open, the crowd spilling in with their chatter and their clinking glasses. The unveiling began. Praise, handshakes, the clatter of a night well won. But my eyes kept finding her, steady amid the storm, and I knew we'd made it. Not just through the fight, but to something more. The distillery glowed around us, Silver Ridge alive in every sip. And as I raised my glass to the room, I felt it, triumph, yes, but also peace, a quiet hope for whatever came next. With her beside me, I could face it all.